Welcome to this week's Halacha Shir. The title is Insincere Mechila. We're now halfway through Elul. We're heading towards Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the Yom Noraim, and it's a very interesting topic. It's something which is largely based on a shir I heard from Rabbi Aryeh Leibowitz, and it's a very interesting topic, which I think people will find interesting. I certainly did. The background is this, and I'm sure we've all been there. Erev Yom Kippur, you're sitting at your Shul Samafsekes, you get a text message, you get a phone call, and perhaps someone who you've had some sort of run-in with over the year has offended you, asks Mechila. He's waited till this moment, perhaps he's mustered up the courage to ask at this very lofty moment, and you were offended by him. But in the spirit of the day, in the spirit of the moment, you moichel him, you say, yes, I forgive you. And then, shortly afterwards, you head off to shul, and you're mulling over it. It's on your mind for the next 25 hours. And in a way, you regret being so sort of instinctively generous. And you didn't want to be moichel him so quickly. The mechila that you gave him was a little insincere. So, how do you deal with that? What does halacha say about that? So that's really the topic for today. Let's take a look at some of the makoros. So the background, if you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com, and B'nei I'll send you the handout. The starting point, a bit of background, is Gemara in Yuma. It's a Mishnah, I think, Pei Hei Amud Beis, Averis Sheben Adam Lemokum. Those Averis, those violations, those sins between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yom Kippur Mechaper. That Yom Kippur is Mechaper. For example, a person ate treif, he broke Shabbos. That is something which is between us and Hashem. And then Yom Kippur is mechaper. We have to do tshuva. 3 elements to tshuva. We deeply regret it. We express our vidui. We articulate our confession. And we undertake to try not to do it again. And then Yom Kippur is mechaper. End of story. Aver shebein adam lechaveroi. However, those sins which were between man and man, en Yom Kippur mechaper shiras es chaveroi. It's not enough that we can actually do tshuva and Yom Kippur comes and goes, but we actually have to appease our friend. If we offended him, we embarrassed him, we did something which he was upset about, we actually have to ask Mechila. And moreover, we're told that the person who is asked shouldn't be too achzari, too cruel and hesitant to be moichel. Plenty of sources for that. One is, if you look in the second box in Parshas Chukas, the pasuk says in Bamidbar Chaf Aleph, "Vayisu mehar hahar derech Yamsuf, vatikza hanefesh ha'am baderech," and they had another difficulty on the journey. Vayidaber ha'am belokim of Moshe, and the people spoke out against Moshe and Hashem. Lomo helisonim Mitzrayim, why did you take us out of Egypt? Lomus Bamidbar, to die in the wilderness. Ki ein lechem ve'en mayim, there's no bread, there's no water. They're complaining. Vayishalach Hashem ba'omes hanachoshim v'hasrofim vayinashchu esa'am vayomos amrov Misrael. There is another plague. Vayovay ha'amel Moshe vayemru chatonu ki dibarnu b'Hashem v'voch. And the people came and they said, look, we're sorry, we slipped up. We spoke against Hashem, we spoke against you. Vayispalel Moshe ba'ad ha'am. And the pasuk says, Moshe Rabbeinu davened for Klal Yisrael. Vayispalel Moshe, says Rashi, mikan lemishim mevakshim mimenu mechila shelo yehachzor milimchol. You see that straight away Moshe Rabbeinu davened. So you see that a person who is asked shouldn't be an achzari limchol. Furthermore, the Mishnah in Baba Kama says in Tzadi Beis Omid Aleph, Afal pishen shunoisin loi ein nimchol loi ad shivakish menu. Even though you stole money from someone and now you return the money, you should still ask that person for forgiveness. How do you know? Because it says Shneim va'atza hoshev eishes ish. The whole incident where Avimelech took Sarah from Avram Avinu, and he had to ask Mechila from Avram Avinu, how do you know that he's not going to be achzari, to be cruel, to not be moichel you? Because it says Vayispal Avram Elokim, etc. Furthermore, the Mata Ephraim says Hamoichel lo yachzari melimchol. This is in Siman Tov Resh Vav Sif Dalet. Someone who doesn't, someone shouldn't be cruel and not be moichel. And anyone who is not ma'avir sin b'Yom Kippurim ein tefillah nishmas. It's an impediment to your own tefillah. If a person is unnecessarily cruel and doesn't forgive another person. Now, before we go back to our question of that insincere mechila, we need to take a bit of a diversion and to discuss another related topic, which I think is an important background to the whole topic. And that is, do you actually have to ask Mechila? Is it a prerequisite of Mechila that if you upset somebody, you actually have to go over to him and ask him, can you please be Meichel me? Do you remember that incident that happened? I'm sorry. Or is it enough for that person just to forgive? Is asking part of the process? And fascinatingly, this is actually a big machlokes. If you take a look at the first Makar in the Dvar Yeshua, Rabbi Shua Ehrenberg, in the paragraph 3, he says the following: does Mechila work when in a situation where the person hasn't actually asked for Mechila? Or do you actually have to ask Mechila? That's part and parcel of the whole process. Like in the Mishnah we just had, which I mentioned before. Because it could be that if you didn't actually ask for Mechila, then min hashamayim you haven't got a clean slate. It's part of the process of tshuva. So he says the following: Yesh livshait mehai uvda d'Yerushalmi. He brings the following answer, this following precedent from a Yerushalmi in Shavuos. Shashayimrin shehiku es Rabbi Tarfon. The Gemara there tells a story that one time some people were holding on to Rabbi Tarfon and they were hitting him. And they realized that they were wrong and therefore they asked Mechila. Heishiv Rabbi Tarfon. The Yerushalmi says that Rabbi Tarfon answered and said, every time you were hitting me, before the whip came down, I was meichel you in advance for the tsar that you're causing me. Mashma, his response was that you don't need to ask me Mechila because I was already meichel you before you even inflicted the pain and damage on me. I was meichel you, so you don't even need to ask. And if you're going to tell me without asking, Mechila doesn't help. What helped is it that he said that he forgave them in advance? Because the mechiling that he gave them was not preempted by a bakasha on their part. And furthermore, another proof is v'chein omrim b'tfilah zaka. We're familiar with tfilah zaka. That's the tfilah we say just before kol nidrei. V'chein, and also to what we say every night. V'chein yesh b'siduri harizal loime b'shas krish ma'ashalamita harini moichel l'chol mi shehichis v'hiknitoisi. We say every night before we go to bed, before Krishma alamita, we forgive that beautiful paragraph where we forgive people who caused us upset. Nobody should be punished as a result of me. So you see from Tfilah Zaka, you see from Kriya Shema Lamita, you see from the case in the Yerushalmi with Rabbi Tarfon that it's possible to give Mechila without the requests first. The person doesn't need to ask it. You can just unilaterally be Meichel. That works, says the Dvar Yeshua. However, the Oz Nidbaru, Rabbi Yomin Zilber argues, if you look at the bottom box, that which you asked, if you can achieve Mechila, you know that the person has forgiven you. But you still need to ask. Says the Oz Nidbaru, that asking Mechila is part of the process. And even if you know the other person has genuinely forgiven you, you still need to ask. It's part of the tshuva process. It's a din in the actual mechila, it's a din in the tshuva. That he may have forgiven you, but you asking is part of that process. And he says, V'hinei b'yuma peizayin amadalef, he gives a great source, a great proof. Rav havale milsa bahadei tabocha. There was one famous Gemara that Rav had some sort of altercation with a butcher, and he went out of his way on Erev Yom Kippur to sort of find that butcher so the butcher could encounter him, in order that hopefully the butcher would ask Mechila. The yesh lavirai misham shafilim am mafurish u'meichel nami le mahani shari botach Rav amashemachel. Rav wanted to be meichel him, so why did he go out of his way to sort of bump into this butcher so that the butcher could ask him Mechila? Rav should just be meichel him wherever he happened to be. He doesn't have to see him. So you see there's a raya that you actually have to ask, and it's not good enough for the person to be meichel. And Rav Sternbuch explains that the theory is that the indignity of asking is part of the kapara. It's awkward to ask. It's a bit embarrassing. But that indignity is part of the kapara. And the Pri Chodosh brings a very interesting proof. He says asking mechila is critical because we're familiar with the halacha that you have to ask 3 times for the person. If the person says, no, I'm not being meichel, you go on a separate occasion, you ask again, and then a 3rd time. And if he still says no, then you get mechila, and the avera goes over to him. But you see, therefore, that asking is central and not the mechila. You had to ask 3 times, and if he's not meichel you, then you're forgiven. That's the rule. So you see that what you see from there is that asking, being mevakish mechila, is the ikka, is the central part, and not the mechila per se. That just sort of happens automatically as we're in that situation. So it's a machlekes. Now, is there any practical difference? Well, one practical difference could be asking mechila by text. Because if you send a text message to another person, perhaps that's not good enough according to the people who require a proper request, to ask the other person for mechila, because there's less indignity than asking in person. And if the kapara is by actually asking properly, and it's a proper proper request and conversation, the other person saying, look, I slipped up, I apologize, please be meichel me. And that is only achieved if you do that in person. But perhaps doing it by text or messaging or whatever is not good enough. Perhaps. Mashenkein, according to the Dvar Yeshua that we saw, then it doesn't make a difference. As long as the person has been meichel, it doesn't make a difference how you actually ask, or even if you don't ask. And certainly by text would be okay. And another possible nafkamina would be, what about withholding mechila so that the person gets a kapara? So, for example, it happens occasionally in school. A kid comes to you and asks mechila. He knows he messed up, so he asks you for mechila, but you feel that it was a bit too quick. That you want him to sweat on it a little bit, and that's part of the chinuch. He should, sleep on it for a day or 2 before you ask mechila. So, what would happen in a situation where he asks you mechila, and you say, "No, I'm you upset me. I'm not. I want to think about it. Come back in a couple of days," and he doesn't come back in a couple of days. Now, you can be meichel him. But on the other hand, he didn't really ask on that occasion. The Ramah says in Hilchas Yom Kippurim in Tov Reish Vav Siv Aleph, the Ramah says, "Hameichel lo yachzor milimchal im lo shemischaven l'tovas hamavakish mechila." If you're doing it for an educational purpose, that would be okay. So you can withhold the mechila if doing so is going to help that person get a proper kapara, which implies you need the kapara of asking, as if it's just you need the mechila, then just be meichel. Why do you need him to come back in a couple of days? That seems to be part of the kapara. But if you're saying that you just need to ask, then maybe not. So those are 2 possible practical differences. Now, let's go back to our question. There's a famous Rambam. Let's take a look at the paragraph 5. Says the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva Perek Beis Halacha Tes, Eina tshuva v'lei Kippurim mechaprin, ela laveir shebein odin lemokum, which is essentially what the Gemara in Yuma Pehei that I quoted earlier. Av laveir shebein odin lechaveiroi, ein nimcha le'olam ad sheyitzin lechaver mashu chayav le'viratzeu. Good. Continues the Rambam. Lo yiratz lechaver limcha lo, if the person doesn't want to forgive him, maybe lo shloisha b'nei odam mireyav v'poigin bo mevakshim meni. You bring 3 people, and you ask him and say, listen again, you've got 3 people standing there, and you say, please, I upset you, please forgive me. Lo nisratz lohen, maybe lo shniya v'shlishis. You do it a 2nd and a 3rd time. Lo yiratza, and if the guy still doesn't want to be meichel you, manicha, you can leave it, v'hoilech lo, and walk away, v'zeh shlo mochel lo hu ha'chayter. And the person who is not forgiving you, he becomes the chayter. V'im hoya rabbi, however, the only exception is if he was your Rabbi, even 1,000 times you've got to go back and ask mechila. Now, the question is, how does that work? So Ari Leibowitz quoted Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, who explains the following. If in a business transaction, one party backs out of a deal, Chazal sometimes say, Ein lo yalov ela tarumos, that he's allowed to harbor bad will, ill feeling against that other person. But if a situation changes, and the heter to do so goes, then it's wrong to harbor ill will against the person. Well, so too. If a person asks 3 times, then the person no longer has the right to be upset, and therefore there's no need for Mechila. That's the lomdus of it. And so too on Erev Yom Kippur. If you were Meichel, and you no longer have the right to be upset. So in our situation, Erev Yom Kippur, the guy called, the message came through, and you said you're Meichel. So now, Ein Lo Yalov Ela Tarumas, that heta of sort of harboring ill will against that person has gone, because you were Meichel him. And therefore you've no longer got a right to be upset. That's perhaps one take on our question. But actually there's more to it. Because the question of whether or not Insincere Mechila works is a machlekas. How so? Rabbi Pitterberger, one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, says that if you say the words, I am Meichel you, then that works, and even though inside you're feeling a little bit of resentment, it still works, based on the concept, the svara of Dvarim Shebelev Einam Dvarim. What I'm feeling in my heart is not considered significant in terms of halacha. For example, a property transaction. If I were to sell a property, and let's say I decided in my mind, in my heart, to add some sort of condition to the sale, well, that's irrelevant. Dvarim shebelev einam dvarim. I can't do that. If I actually went through with this transaction, the transaction is a transaction, and therefore conditional thoughts are irrelevant and are disregarded. Well, so too over here. If I actually said I'm meichel you, if I'm still harboring a resentment inside, dvarim shebelev einam dvarim. That's Etzela Petterberger's take on it. However, Rabbi Yisrael Salanta and the Chazon Ish as well, they argue, and they say that if you still harbor ill will, then the Mechila is not valid. What about Dvarim Shebelev? So, you can answer with Bittul Chometz. Bittul Chometz, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. What's Bittul Chometz got to do with it? I'll tell you. The Ran asks a famous question. If Bittul Chometz works, why do you need to do a Bedika? We spend so long cleaning our houses and being boidek for Chometz, doing Bedikas Chometz. Why do you need to do that, after all, if Bittul works? And that's the famous kasha of the Ran. The Ran answers that we're concerned that the Bittul won't be sincere. I could have, let's say, 10 bottles of very fine single malt whiskey in my cupboard, and I could say, right, it's all bottled, all my Chometz is now annulled. But I'm worried, says the Ran, that maybe my Bittul will be insincere, and therefore you need to do Bedika and either get rid of it or sell it or whatever it is. Says Rabbi Kiva Eiger, why don't we say Dvarim Shebelev? At the end of the day, I said, this chometz should be ka'afravat da'aro, it should be bottled, it should be gone. I've said the words. So surely the concept, the principle of Dvarim Shebelev Einam Dvarim should apply, and therefore any insincere thoughts that maybe I'm thinking I don't really want to get rid of the chometz, we should disregard them, they're irrelevant. So Rabbi Kiva Eiger says the following important principle. Dvarim Shebelev Einam Dvarim are only applicable when they're connected to a maisa, and thoughts don't override that action. So, for example, a property deal. If I decide to do a transaction as a kinyan, I sell something to somebody, and in my mind I've got some sorts of thoughts, well, I ignore those, because I did a maisa, I did a kinyan, and therefore dvarim shebelev einam dvarim. But if the entire matter is dependent on the leiv and your thoughts, then insincerity is fatal. In other words, if the whole concept of bittul chometz is, were you mevatel it genuinely, any insincerity is going to be fatal. It's going to destroy it. And so too with mechila. Mechila is dependent on your leiv, and therefore, if it's insincere, it just doesn't work. So, according to Rabbi Yisrael Salanta and the Chazon Ish, any type of mechila which is not sincere is just not going to work. And the question, therefore, is what do you do in the situation which we described? And the answer, perhaps, is you got to just get to the point and work on yourself where you are meichel properly. And it's hard. Sometimes it's very hard. But there are ways of doing it. You can think positively about the person. You can actually start doing good things to that person, and that creates a sort of a love and a connection to him. But either way, this is a very interesting machlekas. Whether Insincere Mechila works is a machlekas, like I described, between Rabbi Itzla Petterberg on the one hand and Rabbi Yisrael Salanta and the Chazon Ish on the other. And the whole concept of whether or not you need to ask the Mechila, if that's an integral part of the whole Mechila process, like I described, there's a machlokes itself between the Dvai Shua, the Oz Nidbru, and various poskim. The main thing is we should try and behave in a way where we don't upset people. But life sometimes does involve situations where we do cause discord, and therefore certainly we should ask Mechila from anyone we know we've upset. And if we are asked and people want to ask Mechila from us, we should try and work to the point where the Mechila that we give is 100% sincere and genuine. Thank you.